All right, Jeremiah chapter 20. Thanking God always for the ability to even speak, much less to understand, God willing, a little bit more of what he's saying to us as we look at this chapter, which we will call Why. Because why was a prominent question back in chapter 16, but we emphasized the question, what? Understanding that both questions were a smokescreen for the deeds of the people, deeds they were hoping to keep concealed, ironically enough, from God, like that's going to work. But this time it is a question that reflects candor, as Jeremiah, toward the end of the chapter, seems to get a moment to sigh and simply express all of his frustrations in the question, why? Beginning in verse 1, though, verses 1 through 2, will show Pashur, the priest, beating Jeremiah for the words that he spoke back in chapter 19, presumably Jeremiah after the beating in verses 3 through 6, telling Pashur that he will now be renamed Terror on Every Side because his very presence is going to be a terror to his friends, those who have listened to his false prophecies. Many will be slain in front of his eyes. The rest, along with him, will be taken off into captivity to Babylon along with their wealth, helping to give maybe not a full sense of justice to Jeremiah, but that word from the Lord, I'm guessing, had to bring him at least some relief, even if he'd have to wait a while to see it fulfilled. The next verses 7 through 19, will express the beginnings, at least the beginnings in this chapter, of his frustration, saying, God, you have deceived me. For when I cry out violence and destruction, it's like I become a joke, because whatever they have seen fulfilled of the prophecies, it's not enough to keep me from being mocked. But even if I prefer to stop speaking, it's like the words are building up in a manner that won't let me be silent or rest. Therefore, they continue to wait for me to stumble, as verses 11 through 12 are going to lay out his plea for God to vindicate him in all of this. And not just to vindicate him in secret, but showing confidence in God. He describes God as a dread warrior who he is confident will take vengeance for him. But Jeremiah is asking God, please let me see it, in verse 13, rallying a little bit to say a word of praise to God for defending the needy, but it will still not be enough praise to completely lift his spirits, because in verses 14 through 18, the end of the chapter, he is going to curse the day of his birth. Moreover, the messenger who brought word of his birth, rather that messenger actually have killed him in the womb. Jeremiah then describing the womb with him dead in it as blessed, as opposed to the life that he is now living. A life that has led him to ask in verse 18, why did I come out from the womb to see toil and sorrow and spend my days in shame? A question reminding me that no matter how bleak things may seem for Jeremiah, how important it is for him to avoid the temptation to fill in the blanks on God's behalf. Jeremiah legitimately asked God why in chapter 20, not necessarily realizing that the answer was going to come in chapter 21, the very next chapter of his life, literally, as we see it written in the word, not necessarily understanding the timing between chapters 20 and 21. This seems to re-emphasize a word of advice that we got from Paul the Apostle to run with endurance the race set before us, understanding how tempting it can be to check out in situations where things simply seem bleak. And even though the literal chapter breaks were added after the words were actually written in the book of Jeremiah, the metaphorical chapter in his life has significance for not only Jeremiah, but for us, which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. May God give us the strength to turn the page on the current chapter of whatever struggles you may be enduring.